Good afternoon. Welcome to Juneteenth, Freedom Comes to Texas. My name is Andrea Barefield. I'm the Executive Director of Texas Brazos Trail, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. We're here because on June 19th, 1865, Union troops in Texas began to enforce the end of slavery following the Civil War. Approximately 250,000 enslaved Black Texans had new legal status. Among these were people who had been enslaved at the Varner-Hogg Plantation in West Columbia and the Levi Jordan Plantation in Brazoria, both of which are now THC state historic sites. In this program, historians will discuss the impact of emancipation for these newly free Texans. We're so excited to have with us Dr. Chris Elliott, and you'll hear from him. He is the site director of the Varner-Hogg and Levi Jordan Plantation, as well as the Sabine Pass Battleground State Historic Site. He holds doctorate degrees in both business and education, focusing on change and conflict management. Dr. Elliott has worked in the preservation field for over 20 years and has held multiple positions at the National Museum of the Pacific War, Davis Mountain State Park, Balmorhea State Park, Indian Lodge, McLaughlin Home, Fort Lancaster State Historic Site, and Fannin Battleground. Dr. Elliott is also a veteran of the United States Air Force, where he served as a pararescuer for the 31st Rescue Battalion. So we thank him for his service to our country and his dedication to historic preservation. Welcome, Dr. Elliott.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well. Also, we will hear from Sam Collins III. Sam Collins III is a historian from Galveston. He's president of the Juneteenth Legacy Project, a nonprofit that aims to recontextualize Juneteenth as a pivotal moment in the arc of US history, while properly telling the story of its genesis and the day's historic and contemporary relevance. Past and present, he has served on multiple boards, including the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Rosenberg Library Trustee, Ruby Bridges Foundation, Galveston Historical Foundation, Old Central Cultural Center, the NIA Cultural Center, and the Galveston Chamber of Commerce. He's been an instrumental figure in restoration and historical projects throughout Galveston County. A little housekeeping before we get to Dr. Elliott. We welcome your questions, and so please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom box. Depending on your device, the toolbar, it'll either be at the very top or the very bottom, and then click and to tap on that icon that says Q&A. If you don't see it, the little ellipsis, the dot there, and click on that and it'll say more, and you'll have your option to find your Q&A. So enough of this, let's get to the business. So Dr. Elliott, we've recently realized from a national perspective that Juneteenth has been declared a federal holiday. And it's something that had been focused on Texas and Louisiana historically. But can you explain and share with us and all the people in this webinar, what is Juneteenth?
Absolutely. Most, being a Texan, it's a little naive of us to think that, everybody should know about Juneteenth, right? But that's just not true. But you can't really talk about Juneteenth and without talking about the Civil War. Now, unfortunately, there are many theories of why the Civil War was actually fought. Well, and even today, our textbooks will teach you that it was over a war over states' rights. However, the result is still the same. The truth is that it was a war. It was a war over states' rights, but it was over states' rights to decide its own position on slavery. So this was a war fought for freedom to choose slavery, and the only time in recorded history that the oppressors fought each other over the rights of the oppressed. It was the most formative event in this nation's history, but the catharsis of that Union victory and the freedom of the slaves didn't actually begin on January 1st, 1863, when President Lincoln enacted the Emancipation Proclamation. The war was still raging on, and it really wasn't until Lee surrendered at Appomattox did the message begin to filter into the southern states. Even when that Confederate general surrendered those 2 months earlier in Virginia, slavery still remained relatively unaffected in Texas. And it wasn't until U.S. General Gordon Granger stood on Texas soil and read the General Orders number 3, which I'll quote here. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. Juneteenth, short from June 19th, marks the day when federal troops arrived in Galveston and Texas in 1865 to take control of the state, ensure that all enslaved people would be free. The troops' arrival came a full 2.5 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And Juneteenth honors the end to slavery in the United States and is considered the longest running, I believe, African-American holiday. And long overdue, on June 17th, 2021, it officially became a federal holiday.
I know it's one of those things that with reflective of when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and how communities could consider celebrating that. I think even though Texas was a little delayed in the messaging and enactment of the liberation and emancipation of the enslaved, it allows us a little bit a whole separate holiday, because you won't get lost in January 1st for sure. One of those things that our local our state has always has recognized it for a very long time, I believe, as a state holiday, and to have it moved to a national holiday just allows for our community across the country to really get involved and to dig deep into what this meant to Texans for sure, and what the legacy has made and left on community, especially Black communities in the state of Texas. There wasn't a summer that I didn't remember going to Comanche Creek in Limestone County and celebrating Juneteenth. And now, in today's time, you have all the events throughout the state. Now you'll get to have those events throughout the country. I mean, Galveston has certainly done an amazing job at teaching us how to honor the legacy of Juneteenth. So we appreciate hearing that part from you. At this time, we are gonna hear about the historical context. We have a recorded video from Sam Collins, who will join us live for the Q&A a little bit later. But we want to, at this time, be prepared to see this video.
1, to count to 3. 1, 2, 3.
Hello, my name is Sam Collins. I'm a certified tourism ambassador in Galveston, Texas. I'm here in the 1867 settlement, but I want to talk to you a little bit about Juneteenth and the history of Juneteenth in Galveston, Texas. Many of us know the story of Gordon Granger coming in and freeing the enslaved people by issuing General Order number 3, but we don't know the details of what really happened. The Texas Historical Commission works to preserve buildings and structures and renovate them, but today we're going to renovate the narrative of the Juneteenth story. So I often use the analogy of a green salad. The lettuce and tomatoes are the stories that we hear all the time about founding fathers and early settlers. But there's so much more to the story, and there's so much more to this Juneteenth story in Galveston, Texas. Galveston is the birthplace of Juneteenth. And last year, Juneteenth became a national holiday, but it was the former enslaved individuals that kept the oral histories alive. One of my grandmother's childhood friends, attorney Faye Williams, often tells the story that her grandfather shared with her that it was not a piece of paper that freed the enslaved people of Texas, but it was the men with the guns. And the men with the guns were the Union soldiers that came into Galveston and into Texas, many of them being United States colored troops. So when I talked about the renovation of the narrative, when you think about renovating a house, sometimes you have to fix the foundation, rewire it, replumb it, paint it to make it look new again. So as we renovate this narrative associated with the Juneteenth story, we have to tell a more complete story. Some individuals don't know that Union forces that came into Texas, 75% by January of 1866, 75% of the soldiers were United States colored troops. General Philip Sheridan reported that he had 6,500 white soldiers in Texas, 19,768. And why is this important? Juneteenth celebrates the evolution of our country to a more perfect union. So we were not perfect in 1528 when the first non-native enslaved person arrived in this Texas territory. Esteban or Estevanico, part of a Spanish exploration. Before he came here, his name was Mustafa Azamori from Morocco. But this story, this journey of freedom from 1528 until 1865, June 19th, was a long journey. But the narrative that we've heard about is from one perspective. And now we have to tell a more complete story. So when the soldiers came into Galveston, they got off on the harbor side. They went downtown into Galveston and set up their headquarters at 22nd and Strand on the southwest corner in the Osterman building. That building is no longer there. It was hit by a tornado in 1961 during Hurricane Carla. But there's a THC subject marker for Juneteenth at that location and a new absolute equality mural to mark the location where Granger set up his headquarters. And Granger did not actually write General Order Number 3. He actually was in charge of the Texas forces, but the individual responsible for writing General Order Number 3 is Major Frederick Emory under the command of Granger. Emory wrote not only the first part, the first sentence, where all slaves are free, but that second sentence says this involves an absolute equality. When you think about those two words, absolute and equality, what do they mean to you? We're still marching toward that absolute equality. But as those soldiers got off the ships, came into Galveston, and then began to spread the message throughout the city, and then they left Galveston and go further inland into Houston, Brazoria, into other counties to take the message. There was no Twitter, no Facebook or Instagram. So they had to leave by train, ships to go further south in the Gulf. They also had to go by horseback, taking this message of freedom to places like San Antonio, Austin, and other areas, to large plantation sites where individuals had not received the news. Galveston did send out a telegraph on June 20th throughout the country, which was actually reported in newspapers in July of 1865 that state Galveston is now occupied by colored troops. Nowhere in junior high, high school, or even college did I read that in my history books. So the soldiers came in with guns and weapons, but our weapons of mass destruction today are books, knowledge, and information. We use them to destroy ignorance, intolerance, and false narratives by telling a more complete story. So one of the things that I want to do and encourage you, I'm here in the 1867 settlement. So after freedom came, what was so important is this: these former enslaved individuals did not want anything for free. Here in Texas City in the 1867 settlement, they began building churches, schools, homes, and communities. The 1867 settlement is one of the few African-American Reconstruction era communities that's still in existence today. So they began, like I said, to build churches, schools, communities. Our weapons of mass destruction in the books. One of them I want to recommend is Juneteenth, The Story Behind the Celebration, written by Ed Cotham. Juneteenth 101. So if you're just learning about Juneteenth, DJ Norman Cox wrote this book, Juneteenth 101. All of these are available on Amazon. The enslaved people freed themselves. Now in Texas, of course, they did not all free themselves. There were over 250,000 enslaved people. The population increased because enslavers moved westward thinking Texas would never surrender. But there were former enslaved people that joined the Union Army and helped to fight for themselves. And then there were people like Matthew Gaines, a black legislator during Reconstruction, that had ran away a couple of times but got caught. But once freedom came, he became an elected official in the state of Texas. He, along with George T. Ruby, were two black state senators elected in 1869. They fought for public education and the establishment of Texas A&M University and Prairie View A&M University. So this is an important fact that is often left out of our history books, that these black legislators knew that public education was important, and they pushed for that public education. And there's a new statue of Matthew Gaines on the campus of Texas A&M University. and they're planning to put one at Prairie View A&M University. And of course, George T. Ruby was elected out of Galveston in 1869. The other book that I want you to look for is Like Men of War. This is where I found the information that General Philip Sheridan gave about the soldiers in January of 1866. So it was not just the single event of June 19th, but the fact that during Reconstruction that some of these soldiers stayed here immediately after June 19th to help protect the former enslaved individuals, and they still were moving throughout the state of Texas until they were mustered out. So like Men of War, January 1866, there were 6,500 white soldiers in Texas, 19,768 black soldiers. A new book, a cookbook for Juneteenth, Watermelon and Red Birds. You know, there's a lot of controversy over recent news events about the commercialization of Juneteenth. Corporations, I don't want to name corporations, but we have ice cream labeled Juneteenth. We have other organizations that came out with a Juneteenth watermelon salad. But these things, when individuals are putting these things together, they need to communicate with the community and see how best to move forward with these products. But the funny thing is, in Juneteenth 101, I guess it's not really funny, but in Juneteenth 101, DJ Norman Cox actually points out that there was a company in 1933 that advertised a Juneteenth sale on ice cream, the Tutti Frutti ice cream, I think it was called. But the point is, this commercialization of Juneteenth is not new. It has a historical reference to after Juneteenth came, the former enslaved used to celebrate on June 19th, but as it became commercialized, they started celebrating a week or two after and expanding the dates. And for those that were living during the time, they said we should celebrate on the day. So they kept the oral history alive of this important day in not only Texas history, but American history. So individuals say, well, if it's so uniquely Texas, why should the rest of the country celebrate Juneteenth? Well, think about Memorial Day. It commemorates those that gave the ultimate sacrifice. But those family members may have found out January, February, March. So individuals found out about freedom at different times all throughout the country. In Florida, May 20th, in Kentucky, August 8th, in Washington, D.C., April 16th. There are different dates on the calendar because Union soldiers made it to different territories at different times. But we finally have one day on the calendar that we could discuss freedom in America, and we should use this day as a platform to tell the story of how freedom spread all throughout our country. Galveston being the last major port west of New Orleans. So Galveston and Texas was the last to really share the news widely, and Galveston was such an important port and commercial center. That's why Granger and the soldiers came to that territory. They were also coming for supplies as they went further south to secure the southern border. So there's much more to the story. The 5 civilized nations that were in the territory of Oklahoma actually did not free their enslaved people until June 14, 1866. But Oklahoma at that time was not a state, and it was not part of the Union as a state. It was a territory. So Texas represented the kind of last state and the last major port where the announcement was made. So I'm Sam Collins. I'm in Texas City today, but I want everyone to remember that Galveston, Texas is the birthplace of Juneteenth at the southwest corner of 22nd and Strand, where the new Absolute Equality mural is located and the Juneteenth marker is located. Absolute equality is not about equal results. Absolute equality is about giving every individual an equal opportunity to become their very best self. So without hurdles or barriers hindering that growth or development. So we're still on that march toward absolute equality. I hope everyone joins in the Juneteenth celebrations in their communities. You could read about Juneteenth, you could watch videos about Juneteenth, but at some point, if you want to be immersed in the Juneteenth story, I invite you out to Galveston, Texas, to be by the locations, the pier, 22nd and Strand, the 1861 U.S. Custom House, Reedy Chapel Church, Ashton Villa. These are all historic sites related to the Juneteenth narrative, and we want you to celebrate with us freedom from June 19th to July 4th. Happy Juneteenth, and remember, Galveston, Texas, the birthplace of Juneteenth.
That was an amazing presentation by Mr. Collins. And again, he will be on live for the Q&A at the end of our presentation. I noticed there were some questions in the Q&A. The video will be shared. THC staff will work to get you those lists of book titles that Mr. Collins mentioned as he was going forth. One of the best opportunities that we have to continue and really preserve history is to share it. And so the stories that Mr. Collins mentioned about Texas emancipation are true. If you haven't had an opportunity to experience the hallowed ground of Galveston, I encourage you to get down there and so you can truly experience in place what happens and hear the stories and visit the mural of what happened in Galveston, June 19th, 1865. Right now, we'll talk about some other parts of Texas, and Dr. Elliott will share with us what emancipation at the Varner-Hogg and Levi Jordan plantation looked like. I saw something in your bio where it says Lancaster, and I'm sure it's Lancaster, but for those of us who are familiar in the DFW area, that's Lancaster. And so it came out just that quick. So I know that we will, pronunciation matters, but let's share with us about what was happening on the Varner-Hogg plantation and the Jordan plantation at time of emancipation.
First of all, I'd like to speak a little bit about Sam. I've known Sam for many years, and no speaker likes following Sam. He's such a powerful speaker. He's very engaging, and I could sit and listen to him all day. He's just a fantastic asset, and his knowledge and just passion about these topics is it's unparalleled. I'm going to divide the talk up a little bit between the Levi Jordan and the Varner-Hogg plantations, because in order to keep it clear for everybody, because there's a lot of information and you can easily get your wires crossed. So if some of this information is confusing, feel free to reach out to the sites after this webinar, and we'll either clear it up or get you on the right path of the research. I'll begin with the picture that you see here is the Levi Jordan plantation. Now it's pronounced by the family Jordan, as it's pronounced spelled Jordan. I grew up with the word Jordan, but the family actually pronounces it Jordan. So Levi Jordan was born in Georgia in the early 1790s and acquired this property in Brazoria County in 1848. Jordan is believed to have traveled with approximately 12 enslaved workers to begin the development of the plantation before returning to move his extended family. Now, previously he had owned adjoining plantations in Louisiana and Arkansas with his son-in-law, James Campbell McNeil, who married Jordan's only daughter, Emily. Now, Jordan established this sugar and cotton plantation near what we call the Four Forks area of the San Bernard River, on the San Bernard River. And it's near the town of both Sweeney and Brazoria. When constructing this plantation, and again, I'm just trying to build a picture for everybody so they can understand how this operation was, because these plantations were massive economic drivers in this area. They built the wealth of Texas. These enslaved laborers at the Jordan plantation, they built sugar house, the slave quarters, as well as sugar mills, other outbuildings. Between I believe it's 1852 and 1858, Jordan made 2 sugar crops, and you'll see these dates similar in Varner-Hogg. What I can only assume is that was good weather year, so it was a very productive time period for them, and that is just an assumption. But according to the census, he had real property valued at $69,000. Of course, today's time that doesn't sound like a lot. Your vehicle costs more than that, but in that era, that was a substantial amount of money. His personal property was valued at $130,000 and around 144 enslaved individuals. That year, the plantation comprised of about 600 approved acres and produced about 3,000 bushels of corn. The Levi Jordan plantation was half a league, which was 2,222 acres. which is half a league. A full league is the 4,400 acres. His house was constructed a little differently than what we see at Varner-Hogg. It's of longleaf pine that we know is shipped from Florida and transferred on barge, towed up the San Bernardino River. The patent house that we will speak to on the Varner-Hogg Plantation was made of bricks. We know that these enslaved laborers at the Levi Jordan hand-hewed, the studs for the house, the seals, and all from the local oak trees in the area. As for emancipation at the Levi Jordan Plantation, we really don't have a lot of information on it, unlike we do at Varner-Hogg, and I'll get into that here in a little bit. We know that just following emancipation at the Levi Jordan Plantation, they began paying for labor that previously exploited under slavery, and then that with that, the sugar production became unstable and cotton production increased. Likewise, the large, food scale staple production was sustained by the sharecropping and that tenant farming that came afterwards. So if we shift over now to the Varner-Hogg Plantation.
Before you leave from there,
yes,
Dr. Elliott, sorry, one of the questions in
Sure.
the chat addressed how is it that the plantation owners didn't have knowledge of the end of war or the surrender of Lee or the Emancipation Proclamation happening. I mean, part of it perhaps was intentional for the opportunity to exploit, as you mentioned, but I wanted to know if you wanted to go in a little deeper about that.
Well, it's easy in today's time to understand how to communicate. We have communication at our fingertips. I can send a text right now to the other side of the world. Obviously, they didn't have that in that time period. So it was by, it had to basically dilute down into South Texas. That's why they say, Juneteenth being when Granger read those orders in Galveston, that was the official end, because that's about as far south as you can go, right? So the whole United States is aware of the Emancipation Proclamation at that point. Yes, I do believe that it was, to exploit that time period to still get as much production as they can until it was officially notified. But it's just the way the path of communication was a lot slower then, and with some intentional barriers along the way.
Thank you for addressing that.
Not a problem. So the name Varner-Hogg is a little misleading when you're talking about plantation. So the name Varner came from Martin Varner, who was one of the first 300s, the old 300 that received the land grant from Moses Austin. He sold that property to the Pattons, and then the Hoggs actually acquired the property several years afterwards and ended up donating that property to the state. So the name actually says Varner through Hogg. But the majority of our history is about Columbus Patton and what we call the Patton Plantation. We have a lot of information about this site because of several things. Patton, Columbus Patton never married, never had children that we know of. And late in his life, he was declared mentally unstable in court by his relatives and institutionalized in South Carolina in 1854. I believe he died of typhoid in 1857. He also had treatments for brain tumors, whatnot. And his last will and testament were contested by his family members and continued for years after his death. With that contest came probate records. With probate records, because the enslaved were considered property at that time, they were, for lack of a better term, inventory. So we have this extensive, because there was value assigned to those enslaved, we have this extensive record that gives us a really solid glimpse into what it was like at the Patton Plantation. So Columbus Patton, he was part of a large and wealthy family from Kentucky, moved to Texas in, I believe, the beginning of the 1830s. He purchased 4,428 acres from Martin Varner's property in 1834, including, what is now known as the Varner-Hogg Plantation site. So soon after the purchase of the property, he began construction of the main house and several outbuildings with the labor of the enslaved. Obviously, the plantation remained in Patton's name until his death in 1857, and he died at the age of 45. It was then operated as a family enterprise. His brother Charles actually took over the property, and the records of the property were kept by a probate manager all the way through the 1870s. So when you actually, with all of the probate records, there's also WPA Narratives, which is a fantastic resource. In a really, the records for all this, trace nearly 200 enslaved people between 1830 and 1865. That is just an amazing amount of information. And they provide a kind of a complicated yet sometimes confusing timeline of the events that affected their lives. And the exact number of people is difficult to determine because of the variations even in the spelling. The Patton's family frequent movement of enslaved individuals from one plantation to another, and they also leased out these enslaved to neighbors and associates. So it's impossible to tell if this movement actually happened because of family perception, or they're trying to avoid some tax laws or inheritance laws. So you have to understand that it was a business, the business of slavery. The individuals who can be traced, 8 of the people who appear on the 1880 census in the area themselves having been born in Africa between 1805 and 1820. That's extremely significant, as that suggests that some of the enslaved were brought directly from Africa to the Republic of Texas, since the United States outlawed international slave trading in, I believe it was 1808. So, it's the amount of information that's at that site is very essential in telling this timeline of how we got to this point. I want to talk a little bit about 2 former slaves that we actually have the WPA narratives on. One was being Sarah Ford and Anthony Christopher. They were interviewed, I think it was 1938, as part of the WPA narratives, the Writers Project, so the Works Progress Administration Writers Project, and it documented the lives of African Americans during the antebellum years. These interviews kind of combined with other research, in the plantation records, really spell out the specific jobs of the enslaved people on the property. They include like the sugar house man, the tanner, the shoemaker. I can go on all day, but I wanted to read a little bit from that narrative. And again, you have to remember Sarah Ford was she was 7 at the time of emancipation, and so she was a young child. She was 80 years old when they did this narrative with her. She had, she was born on what they called Columbus Patton Kit. So Kit Patton, or Master Kit. And she was born into slavery. So, you got to take a step back and imagine what that would have been like. You never knew freedom until emancipation. So that's a whole different perception. So her actual narrative is, again, I want everybody to reach out to us to get the complete narrative, because you need to really put it into context. It is a fascinating read, an absolutely fascinating read. But I want to read just a couple of little excerpts to give you an idea of her personality, because it really does warm you a little bit. And I'm going to paraphrase these for clarity as well as appropriateness. And again, anybody wants to reach out and see the actual quote, please do that. So she stated at the beginning of the narrative, which is a sentence I've highlighted and I just absolutely love. It says, Law me, you want me to talk about the slave times, and you caught me before I had my coffee this morning. But when you get as old as I, all you can do is talk. So excuse me while I put this coffee on the fire, and I'll tell you what I can. And I'm sorry, I could just picture this very strong African American woman saying this, going, you know, I'll talk to you, but not before my coffee. So it's coffee is very important, right? She goes down in the narrative and talks about life at the Patton Plantation. And she said that Master Kit, which was Columbus Patton, had two brothers, Master Charles and Master Matt. They both lived in West Columbia, and Kit lived on the side of Varner Creek, and Charles lived on the other side. Kit had an African woman from Kentucky for a wife, and that's the truth. I ain't saying if she's a real wife or not, but all the slave has to call her Miss Rachel. But if a bird fly up in the sky, it must come down sometime. And Rachel, just like that, a bird. Because Master Kit go crazy and die. Now Master Charles take over the plantation, and he takes Rachel and puts her back in the field. She won't stay in the field long, because Master Charles puts her in the house by herself, and she doesn't work anymore. Now that leads to the relationship that Columbus Patton has with enslaved individual Rachel, and our exhibits, and I don't want to go too much into that story because our exhibits cover all that, and again, please reach out. But as we continue on in the narrative, she starts talking about what happened on the day on Juneteenth, and on the day that the Emancipation Proclamation was read to the enslaved of the Patton Plantation. And so on her statement, it says, when freedom come, I didn't actually know what that was. And that goes back to her being born into, slavery. I heard Uncle Charlie Burns, who drives the buggy for Master Charles, come running out of the yard and yelling, everybody free, everybody's free. Pretty soon soldiers come and the captain reads a proclamation. And law me, that one time Master Charles can't open his mouth because the captain tells him to shut up, that he would do all of the talking. And then the captain said, I come to tell you that the slaves are free. You do not have to call anybody master no more. We all just mill around like cattle do. And Master Charlie say, if you want to stay, he'll pay us. Except for my papa, he said, you can't stay here. You are a bad influence. And that's just a little brief, very brief glimpse into the life of Sarah Ford. And again, her narrative is quite extensive as well. Now, if we move forward to Anthony Christopher. Now, Anthony Christopher was, I believe, 14 at the age of emancipation. And we also remember that Columbus Patton died before Juneteenth. So it was his brother still running the plantation at the time. Now, in Anthony Christopher's narrative, he talks a little bit. He didn't really know that much again in his recollection. Can't even talk this morning because he was young. So he reveals that in his narrative that he's trying to recall these memories, and so he's saying that Christmas was a big time for the kids and the grown-ups. They had a barbecue, a lot of sweets. Miss Patton, Master Patton let everybody dance in the sugar house. So it gives a little bit of a glimpse in what the life, beyond the servitude of slavery, and the harshness. There was a sense of community. There was a sense of resilience, that set the foundation for the African American community today. And he talks about, how much they ate. He was about to bust, and I really enjoy reading his narrative because you can really relate to it. And he talks about this bark tea that they made that really sounds like it upset his stomach, so he didn't really appreciate that much. But when he starts talking about the day of Juneteenth, you know, he said that, you know, everybody was essentially didn't understand what it meant. You know, it just was it real? What could you do? What could you not do? And these individuals were actually lost. They didn't know what to do. They've been spent their entire lives, you know, in servitude, and then one day have this freedom. And it's really hard to comprehend that. Even in today's standards, it's hard to comprehend how these individuals would even have felt to just go from that and just flip a switch. And he said that, you know, most of them stayed around to sharecrop and tenant farm as well. But we also know that another thing came after Juneteenth, and that was slavery by another name, and that's convict labor. That's a whole different topic. We won't get into that. But it's really it's really important to Texas, but now to the whole United States, of how these individuals became free, the process of, and how we got to where we're at today. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the sites and the history of the site. So Varner-Hogg, or the Patent Plantation, covers a very large expanse of time versus the Levi Jordan. Now, the Levi Jordan, the state purchased that property from the descendants of Levi Jordan in early 2000s. And in 2008, it transferred from Parks and Wildlife over to the Texas Historical Commission. The patent place has an extensive history, from Martin Varner through the Columbus patent through the Hogs, was owned by several different entities, and to eventually being purchased by the Hogs and then donated to the state. So to give everybody just a little brief glimpse into that timeline. As of today, and how the plantations sit today, Levi Jordan sits on approximately 90 acres of the original plantation. We are looking to acquire additional properties, and one of those properties is the cemetery that the enslaved were buried in. And as we move that program forward, we're hoping to learn a lot more about the enslaved lives, not necessarily at the Levi Jordan Plantation, but in the area. The Levi Jordan Plantation's archaeology has remained fairly intact through all these years. So currently, if you notice the little sign I have in my background, we have recently opened the Levi Jordan Plantation to the public. It has been closed for guided tours only. We have completed the $3 million construction project that has consisted of a visitor center, as well as archaeology lab and an education center. Those facilities are to gain more insight into the life of the enslaved. We know a lot about planters and about the plantation owners. There's a lot of records. We know very little about the enslaved who built these plantations. So the goal of the Levi Jordan Plantation is to do more archaeology, is to better understand, and also to bring the public in to get them involved. This is not our little golden egg. This is the public's facility. We want everybody to understand the process that we do in order to gain all of this information. We want them to be able to get their hands dirty. We want them to really, be emotional, to emotionally tie themselves to the site. So with this facility, we also don't want it just to be a Brazoria County thing or a Texas thing. We want it to be a national project. So in our facility, we have 8 bedrooms that will allow individuals to come in, despite their socioeconomic statuses, come in and stay with us, do research, participate in the archaeology, participate in educational programming without the fear of it costing too much. We want to make sure that this is available for everybody, and we're really excited about this facility. Please go onto our Facebook page, on our social media, Instagram, look at the hours of operations, reach out to us. Again, this is a site for the public. It is not, it is not our little golden egg. Hey, Sam, I see you finally joined us. Great. As for the Varner-Hogg, it sits on, the plantation sits on 300 of the original 4,000 acres. Our exhibits up until 2011 focused mainly on the planters' experience. I'm a Hogg's vision of what a plantation life would have looked like. We are looking at revisiting that vision as we speak. We have about 2,000 square foot of exhibits focusing on the enslaved aspect of the site. And so I invite everybody to come out and see those exhibits. They're fascinating. They can be a bit emotional, and that's absolutely fine because this is a very emotional topic. And reach out to our educators and visit with the staff. So that's kind of the gist of both the sites. And again, if you want to know a lot more, we just really scratch the surface of this. We have a 6,000 square foot research facility at Varner-Hogg Plantation that has all these probate records in there, has an on-staff curator that will assist you in all of your research needs. And the same goes for the Levi Jordan Plantation as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Elliott. It was so much information, and we've got several questions in the chat. And then let's begin with one of the questions was, as you mentioned, after emancipation and the offering, especially with in your reference to Ms. Ford, were there any resources given to the formerly enslaved to help them learn how to adapt to their newfound freedom?
I'm not really for sure exactly what resources were given. Sam may have a better idea of, maybe other sites. I haven't found any in any of the narratives at this point. That's not saying that it doesn't exist. I'm just unaware of it. Sam, are you aware?
Welcome, Mr. Collins.
For the most part, the individuals were free but not given any resources. So W.E.B. Du Bois talks about that. They stood in the sun for a second, and then in this newfound freedom, and then the reality hits. You don't own the land, you don't own a wagon, a horse, or anything. But there had to be white landowners that were willing to sell property to former enslaved individuals, which eventually led to Black settlements and towns, places like Kennelton, Freedmanstown, the 1867 settlement. That 1867 settlement couldn't have happened if not for a white landowner in the Galveston County area being willing to sell to Black cowboys that had worked on the Chisholm Trail and at the Butler Ranch. So there was nothing given freely. They worked for it. They paid for these places. You take Emancipation Park. There was no public place for individuals to celebrate, but they pooled their resources, and they actually bought that land. This year they celebrate 150 years from 1872 to 2022. So the individuals. Sorry about that. I had a call come in. When given opportunity, the properties. And there was many sharecropping agreements that were set up and tenant farming. So if you look at balance sheets prior to the end of slavery, the wealth was stored in the people. So you look at a tax report, 268 people are valued, and one I looked at $108,000, 16,000 acres of land valued at $80,000. So the 200 people, almost 300, was worth more than the 16,000 acres. But what happens after slavery ends is that the manipulation of the balance sheet, the value goes into the land. Oh, you need somewhere to stay. So now you got to rent space to stay. Oh, you need a house. Right. Oh, you got to rent the house. So I'm going to pay you $10, but I'm going to take 12. Well, they ain't quite, but you end up in more debt at the end of the year. And you say, how did this happen? I worked all year. But even in that environment, there were so many success stories. And as I said, Kennelton, Freedmanstown, the 1867 settlement, over 500 individuals, 500 freedom colonies that have been identified by Dr. Andrea Roberts and her team with the Texas
Yes.
Freedom Colonies. I mean,
Yes.
that's, I don't know what has been shared because I jumped in the meeting late, so I hope
No, it hasn't, but that's a whole other seminar and webinar in itself, because the Freedom Colonies are amazing. If you haven't been able to deep dive, and Dr. Roberts has just led that charge in a way. I think she was in DC this week speaking about the Freedom Colonies. So she is sharing the history and impact that the Freedom Colonies have had on our state. Good to see you, Mr. Collins. We're glad you made it in with us. We're so happy to hear from you. We're getting to our questions. I have been cleared to go over a little bit if we need to, because there are so many questions that people want to hear from you all. And so we're going to be respectful of your time and allow closing in about 5. We're going to answer a few more questions, allow you all to offer closing comments, so that, and how people can get more information from you. One of the things that have been popped in the chat is Montpelier incorporated descendants of the enslaved people from the plantations in the area to their governing board, are either the Levi Jordan plantation or the Varner-Hogg Plantation. Are there any plans to identify or incorporate descendants of the enslaved people into these properties?
Absolutely. We have a project, our descendants project going on at Varner-Hogg right now from a grant we have received. And, you know, as I said before in the presentation, there's little that we know about the enslaved and as well as the descendants. So we're creating a process for these individuals to come to us and start to record all this information. Genealogy, I mean, we're just at the very forefront of this, and hopefully 10 years down the road, we're really making some ground. But yeah, it's absolutely, we follow Montpelier and all of the, because our facilities are similar in what we're trying to do. And it is essential to have descendants from both the planter and the enslaved to help tell this complete inclusive story. So seeking out the descendants from the enslaved is just it's an essential part to what we're trying to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It goes to speaking to complete history. Yes, sir.
Absolutely.
Yeah. My fourth great grandfather registered to vote August 3rd, 1867 in Brazoria, Texas. And on that registration, he states that he's been in the area 15 years. He was 25 years old, meaning that he would have been brought into this area in 1852 as an enslaved child. Now, some records I've found have him about 5 years older, but the point is, I'm one of those descendants doing this work here in Texas and all over the country. And it is an honor for me to be involved to help tell a more complete story. I often use the analogy of a green salad. The lettuce and tomatoes are the stories you hear all the time. Stories about the founding fathers and early settlers, which excludes founding mothers and all the other people that contributed. But this salad has croutons, bacon bits, sliced onion, bell pepper, pickles. Y'all getting hungry, it's lunchtime. So we're gonna flavor up this history as we tell a more complete narrative. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that this story in Texas about Juneteenth and freedom is not solely about enslavement and pain and suffering. It's about freedom and opportunity, and what those former enslaved did with that freedom and opportunity. Between 1865 and 1915, we had more colleges and universities and schools and businesses set up. They were not looking for anything free. They were not looking for a handout. They just wanted to be left alone to live their lives just like everybody else. We understand that history is not as nice as we would have hoped or thought when they heard the General Order number 3 and they heard the words, "This involves an absolute equality." Not only that they were free, but in the second sentence, it says, "This involves an absolute equality." So do we have that yet, even today? So we're pushing to get to that ultimate goal of absolute equality. And absolute equality is not about equal results. Absolute equality is about giving every human being an opportunity to become the very best version of themselves
without hurdles or barriers hindering that growth or development. So we as a society need to do the work to give everybody an opportunity. And as we tell more of these stories, a complete narrative, we just want to tell the truth so that we could heal and become a better nation, a better state, and just better individuals.
Absolutely. I know that Dr. Elliott, you had mentioned the Federal Writers Project and the Slave Narrative Collection. You mentioned that you all have portions of that at your at the Jordan Plantation, or is it at Varner-Hogg?
At Varner-Hogg. Yeah,
Okay.
Varner-Hogg. Yeah.
So that's an opportunity for people to spend more time with a deep dive into that, hearing from those enslaved and then newly freed African Americans, especially Texans. And also, I remember several years ago, I think this project has been important, and it's when you were reading it and you said what you could hear her words and hear her voice. Hollywood got into this, I believe, in the early 2000s when HBO did a documentary, and it was called Unchained Memories. Yeah. And so you have Hollywood's elite reading these narratives of the enslaved. So it's one, I don't even know if it's available anymore, but it's something that you could look at. Mr. Collins, one of the things that what we want to look at and take away, and there are several questions about historical connection in Texas. You know names like you're listening at the Levi Jordan plantation. Descendants is Barbara Jordan, that one of those descendants. The Hog Foundation is the Varner-Hogg, the Houston Hogs. I mean, it's all those things that interconnect, and I think that with a deep dive into our state historic sites, that gives people the opportunity to really learn and connect, and how our Texas lines connect their dots. But Mr. Collins, one of the things I want to make sure that I get to you, because you are Galveston, you are the birthplace, and I mentioned earlier, hallowed ground of what Juneteenth is and means. And so I want you to share a little bit about, now that the nation is recognizing this opportunity. How do we encourage, and you mentioned in your video, and thank you for saying how monetizing, capitalizing on Juneteenth is something that should be done very carefully and with consideration of the community that you involve. But tell people how, especially people who are not African American, how to celebrate and embrace this culture and learn more about what this holiday, Emancipation Day, means, not only to the state, what it would mean to you, because again, if you're telling full stories, you're telling both sides of the coin. So everyone's role and responsibility. So can you just kind of talk about that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. I tell individuals, you could read about Juneteenth, you could watch a video or documentary, attend a meeting about Juneteenth, but to be immersed in the story, you have to come to Galveston. You have to come by the historic sites, the port area where the soldiers came in, the downtown area where the Union headquarters was set up. Retrace the steps as they moved through the city past the U.S. Custom House, 1861. Custom House, into Reedy Chapel, where they posted that notice. This journey of freedom and this message of freedom spread from this island through the oral histories of the ancestors that were present at that time. One of my grandmother's childhood friends, Miss Attorney Faye Williams, often tells a story that her grandfather told her it was not a piece of paper that freed the enslaved people of Texas, it was the men with the guns. And of course, many of them being United States colored troops that came and spread the message of freedom. So this journey that we've been on to keep this oral history alive, there is a National Juneteenth Observance Foundation that had been fighting since the 1990s, 94, to get Juneteenth recognized as a national holiday. So while it became popular in 2020, there have been over 2 decades, almost 3 decades. It was 27 years in the making. So while people are just learning about it, the story has been out there, and it's been important to Texas and to Texans and those that left the state and went to other states and spread this message. And the soldiers that came in, they took that news back that they had been in Texas and helped to free enslaved people. So now that it's a national holiday, we In Texas, we do things bigger. We want everybody to know. Galveston, Texas is the birthplace of Juneteenth. Juneteenth and grew up, got an undergraduate degree, master's, PhD. Juneteenth and went around the world, international traveler.
Yes.
But you always can come home.
Home.
You know, you might have a 6,000 square foot house, but you get more sleep at Big Mama house in that little full-size bed, that twin-size bed. Come on home to Big Mama house. You know, I know you didn't grow up and you got your fancy car and your big house, but when you come home to the family reunion, that's Galveston, Texas. And we want to welcome everybody to come to Galveston and retrace those steps and tell the stories in your communities of the celebrations that were kept alive by the ancestors. You know, in 1979, of course, Al Edwards got the state holiday, but 100 years before that, in 1879, State Representative Robert Evans from Navasota pushed to get Juneteenth as a holiday, but it didn't happen. It didn't pass. So it's not that people were not trying. This is, of course, after the compromise of 1877. So we don't tell that history to stay locked in the past. We tell this history to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. So Maya Angelou has a great quote. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. So we have to do the work to tell the truth of the history and celebrate what this freedom meant, not be locked in just bondage and suffering stories, but talk about people like Dr. Dudley Woodard and John Rufus Gibson and Justin McGuire. And these are just some local people in Galveston, but all of these success stories. Walter Moses Burton, the first elected Black sheriff, not only in Texas, but the United States. That is a Texas story that we should celebrate.
And this is an opportunity that we really have to begin to tell those tales. This will not be the last webinar that we do, and we are so grateful for the Texas Historical Commission for doing its due diligence for sharing our full and complete histories, because that's how we better ourselves as Texans. That's how we better ourselves as Americans, when we have opportunity to engage and understand our whole and complete story. I want to thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom, imparting your knowledge, and embracing your Texas pride and sharing the story of Big Mama's house, of our foundational home in Galveston, Texas, and celebrate and allowing Texans and our country to celebrate and honor the legacy of Juneteenth. We want to thank the information. So many questions did not get an opportunity to get asked, and I know that and answered. But I want to make sure that your information is in the chat.
I want to make sure that we put the Juneteenth birthplace.com will list the events in Galveston that are happening this weekend. So JuneteenthBirthplace.com. We have the Juneteenth Legacy Project.com. Was about our Absolute Equality mural project in Galveston, a 5,000 square foot mural. It's a public art project that reimagines monuments and memorials and public spaces. And as we do this work all throughout the country, if you think about our American home, if you go into a house and there are no pictures of you in that house, you don't feel welcome. So what we're doing is not to take down pictures, but to add pictures on the walls so that when people enter, this is our home collectively. We all love Texas. We all love America. We're all on the deed of this house, and we all have work to do in this house, chores. Some people don't want to do their chores in the family, but we're gonna make them do their chores so that we put more pictures on the wall and tell a more complete Texas history story.
Absolutely. Dr. Collins, please make sure that you share your information so that people can get down and visit you at our amazing state historic sites.
Yeah, I saw in the chat that it's been added a couple of the short documentary video link that I did. And then it'll also be posted. We have a 17-minute promo, but we had and at the IMAX Theater in Galveston, they're showing the documentary this weekend, 11, 3, and 6:40. And I'm so excited that a major corporation just bought out the theater at 3 o'clock, so tickets will be free. So I mean, the news is spreading. I can't announce that corporation yet, but there'll be a news release soon. And it's just exciting to see. And that is the kind of good corporate partnership that we need to come in and be supportive of programming.
Yes.
So thank you so much.
We are so excited to hear that there are so many things that are going on in the community. Did you have something, Dr. Elliott?
No, I was just going to say, it's one thing to read about it. It's one thing to discuss it. It's a whole different thing to come see it. And so I want to make sure everybody just come down and see what we're doing and talk with us, because it all begins with the conversation. It really does.
Absolutely. We want to thank you again, Mr. Collins, Sam Collins, and all of your amazing preservation work that you do and the legacy that you have left and the impact that you've made. I know you've been doing the Texas Trail this weekend, so you are probably in 55 cities leading up to Juneteenth weekend. So we appreciate you taking the time to do this. Chris Elliott, the site manager for the Levi Jordan and Varner-Hogg Plantations, we appreciate the impact that you have made on this state work. Our always thanks to Texas Historical Commission for opening these doors for these conversations to be had, for the advancement and uplifting of Texas, because again, preserving history is sharing it. We want to make sure that we do, as Mr. Collins suggested in his video, we're going to celebrate freedom from Juneteenth to July 4th. So as we move along and do these things, make sure that you find out what's going on locally in your community. If you can't get to Galveston for Juneteenth weekend, do something to learn and honor and educate yourselves on the amazing opportunity that we have to celebrate the legacy of Texas and the history and honor of Juneteenth. I'm Andrea Barefield, Texas Brazos Trail Executive Director. We appreciate you joining us this afternoon.